Hello, Chuck.
Hello.
How you doing?
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
You're welcome.
Yeah, what that lady was describing, Pat, I actually experienced the same thing. It was at Nickel Beer Night at West L.A.
Oh.
Well, that's
anyway,
cheating if you do it with
earlier
beer.
You had somebody talking about whenever these people start comparing religion to science, I can't help but point out, all I have to do is say, remember Galileo. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the Galileo, who is considered the father of modern science, proved that the earth revolves around the sun. And the Catholic Church had been preaching that the earth is the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. And whenever he proved them wrong, they locked him up for the remainder of his life.
Mm-hmm. And so, he got off easy.
If religion is anything, it is the anti-science.
Mm-hmm. But also remember the convenience of hundreds of years passing and none of the people who actually locked up Galileo still being alive. And so people who are religious are now free to spin stories like, oh, well, actually, those were Catholics and they're nothing like us. And really, when you come down to it, they didn't, they were atheists if you look at it in a certain way. Believe it or not, I've actually heard that stuff.
Right, yeah. Exactly. But
so, I mean, by the time that Galileo's scientific discoveries come to be common scientific knowledge, the church was able to just disavow any, oh, those guys weren't true Christians.
Well, they also, the Vatican apologized, within the last century.
Yeah.
For their treatment of Galileo.
John Paul.
Yeah, John Paul, and he did. But what's interesting is when you look at their apology and read the wording of it, right? It doesn't. You don't get the impression that they're apologizing because, well, it's wrong to imprison a man for his views that are in conflict with the received dogma of the church.
Yeah.
That was actually, they weren't acknowledging that. They weren't acknowledging the simple. They were just saying that this was, not the way to have dealt with the situation, and they weren't acknowledging that Galileo was right and the church was wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so...
I mean, if anything, they've sort of reinterpreted scriptures. I mean, religion evolves, just like any other beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so that
the
now
Old Testament and the New Testament, they had to rewrite the Bible.
There's that. But, I mean, neither of those turned out to be right anyway, so they had to come up with sort of shoehorn biblical concepts into facts which were established by science that had no input from religion, and then religion comes along and gets to take credit for that, which is why now you have like Muslims saying, oh, if you read it right, the Quran actually predicts exactly what the speed of light was, and nonsense like that. Religions love to do this, to take credit for stuff that they used to oppose.
Oh, sure, yeah. It's like these creationists. They take one sentence from the Bible, God created the universe and everything in it, and they try to come up with a science class out of that.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Mark
interesting.
my words, in another 200 years, the church will be finding all kinds of verses that show how perfectly the Bible described evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what you're seeing now, in the relationship between religion and science, ever since we had that wonderful Enlightenment thing, and churches were no longer allowed to run all of Western civilization, as it were. We now have this interesting relationship between religion and science where the most ardent fundamentalist religious believers, on the one hand, deplore science and they resent science because it comes up with this annoying stuff like evolution. And depending on how hardcore they are, heliocentrism and what have you. But on the other hand, they recognize that in our modern day culture, science is the agent of intellectual prestige. If you actually want to prove something, you got to do it scientifically using the scientific method. And so now you get you get these creationists, you get these guys like Kent Hovind and Karl Baugh getting their fake mail-order degrees so they can call themselves doctor and spouting these pseudoscientific theories and again, it's putting on the pretense of it's cargo cult science now is essentially what they're doing.
Yeah.
They think, we'll put on lab coats and we'll put the word doctor in front of our names, and we'll write very laughable little papers and call them our doctoral dissertations, if you've ever read Kent Hovind's dissertation. And we'll set up little groups, and we'll call it the Institute of this and the Institute of that, and to sound all scientific. And if we go through the motions of science, suddenly our superstitious beliefs will be scientifically valid and respectable, just like all that actual science that the eggheads at universities do with their darn grants and research and stuff. Doesn't quite work that way, and they don't really get it, but they know that they at least have to put on the show, even if the show is really lame.
Yeah, well, these creationists, they want to just wipe out 1,000 years of scientific study that's based on observation and documentation.
Well, be fair, evolution is only 150 years of observation.
Well,
and
Darwin's
documentation.
theory, yeah.
Well, actually, medicine would literally be 1,000 years ahead if it were not for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church outlawed study of
anatomy,
corpses is what they'd outlawed. Study of corpses for about 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Right.
We would definitely be perhaps a lot farther along in a lot of things had it not been for the church in many ways. It's difficult to say if it's going to be 1,000 years or a couple hundred or what have you. But yeah, I think that certainly in some things, definitely in medicine, we would be a lot farther ahead than we are. I mean, the Muslim world in like the 13th, 14th, 12th to 14th century was actually much farther ahead in medicine than the West was.
In the 800s, I think they were the world leader in mathematics and science, and then they just kind of went downhill from there.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's possible we may have had germ theory a couple hundred years before we actually did, and what have you, had it not been for religious meddling about, oh no, corpses, you can't. That's you can't do that. It's sacred stuff.
Anyway, thanks for calling.
Great. Hey, listen, I'm always happy to bash religion.
Well,
okay.
Alrighty then.
Thanks for letting me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the call. Thanks for watching.
We're always happy to bash religion also.
I was really feeding back on his call very
I know. Although we do also promote positive atheism. We